The idea of the body being intelligent, I think, probably strikes people as, well, okay, I guess that could be, but most of the intelligence is up here. That's where it is. I think an interesting commentary on why that's not the correct way to look at things is the history of the attempt that has been made over the last 50 to 60 years in two areas that are really important in computer science and in engineering: the development of artificial intelligence and robots. These have been enormously unsuccessful. Decades went by, beginning right after the end of the Second World War, where people thought this was going to be it. We know that we can solve complicated math problems. We know that what we need to do is make some nice little motors that can make things walk or grasp or move things. So we have some challenges in that area. But then we'll send commands to those things because we've got all this computer processing power and we can do it. It was enormously unsuccessful. And it's only been in the last decade even that people have understood that's not how the body works with the mind. That there is an intelligence that is embodied in the body. It's not all going on up in the head and signals are being sent to make the muscles move or my mouth, lips move. The intelligence is certainly for high-level cognitive processes, and we're going to talk about those. There is a huge effect that the large human cortex has and can do that. But there's a whole lot of other things that need to be done. And if you ask what's a really hard problem, you might think, well, it's to solve some really complicated math problems, complicated logistics problems. No, this is a really hard problem to walk. It's a very hard problem because the feet have to sense where they are. They have to send signals back to the rest of the body and the muscle. In other words, the whole thing has to be orchestrated together. It can't be this brain sitting up here that is running the walking. So that's the new thing that's developed that I really would like to tell you about, and I hope you'll find interesting. This, of course, is a body, but those are not bones. Those are the major nerve pathways. And they're not even all of the nerve pathways. There are much more that's not there in fine-scale nerve pathways. So you see that there's this central vagus nerve that runs down the backbone along the spinal cord here. But I just wanted you to get fixed in your mind that the body is full of nerves. And, of course, up in this brain, there are really a lot of nerves. Now, human beings, compared to chimpanzees, which is one of our closest primate relatives, you'll notice that there's a lot in the brain structure and the spinal cord structure and the nerve structure of other primates and human beings. Lots of similarities. But the one big difference you'll see here, and this happened about 8 or 9 million years ago, when Homo sapiens departed from the rest of the primates, and this very large cortex came into being. And that's one of the things that makes us distinctive. Now, it's true I'm beginning with the brain, but we're going to now see how this relates to what the rest of the body is doing. So in this brain and this brain stem that feeds up to it, I'm going to just divide things into two groups. It's a lot more complicated than this, but this is a good first cut. We have a lot of sensory, emotional, and motor networks. Motor networks are the networks of nerves that run your muscles. And sensation from the various parts of the bodies that have nerves that sense. And there are emotional networks that have neurochemicals in them that are flowing down and up into the brain. So these networks are fast acting, and they're mostly automatic, and they're mostly outside of consciousness. If you suddenly see a spider crawling on you, you knock it off and you may jump back. This is happening down here in this area. Now, in this cortex that is quite unique to human beings, the large cortex, these networks are thoughtful. This is where thinking is taking place for the most part, and they're slow acting. It takes time to think through things. So this is the division that I want to make up, and I'm going to call them level 1 and level 2 so that we know what we're talking about. Level 1, you could think of, sometimes people say those are the lower functions, the more ancient functions, and the upper level ones are the higher functions. But we'll call them level 1 and level 2. So what is level 1 about? Well, level 1 is about seeing, hearing, feeling, and a whole lot more things like that. And responding to what you see, hear, or feel in the motor networks, grasping, holding, walking. These are all level 1 dominated processes. Level 2 is about evaluating, where we consider and hold things up, balance them against each other, look for contrasts and parallels. We theorize in level 2. We try to explain what's going on. And another thing that takes place in level 2 is believing. So those aren't the only things, but there are 3 very important things that take place in level 2. So I just want to say one more thing about level 1. If you can, hold your hands together like you're going to wash them and work them together, and now let them just flow into one another as if they were just holding hands with each other. And they were, just let them flow wherever they want to go. You can bring them together and keep it going. I think you'll discover that they can do this without you thinking about it much at all. They'll keep going even while I'm talking, while you're listening. They kind of want to keep going. They kind of have their own thing happening here. Isn't that amazing? They like it. They want to keep going. So where's the intelligence that's making this? And it's not easy to do this. If you tried to make a robot do this, it would be very hard to do. So there is an intelligence that's embedded in these nerve fibers and in these motor systems that's in the body. Okay. Now level 2 is where thought and language are primarily rooted. But what I want to really point out and make a strong point of is these things are physically grounded in level 1. Thought and language don't just exist in the air. Language doesn't exist as a bunch of words that are in the dictionary. So that if you want to know the meaning of the word, you look it up in the dictionary, and it tells you a bunch of other words that it's related to. But where does the first word come from? Let's see about that. This is a word that is clearly something that is in level 2 when we're talking about spirituality and spirit, or even spirits. Because probably it's true that most people in the world believe that there are spirits that move about, that can come from the planets and come down, or can enter your body they can talk to you, they can react with you. This is a very widespread belief. I don't want to get into whether those spirits exist or don't exist or much about it. That's not the point I'm making. It's about the origin of the word. Where does that word come from? And so this level 2 word, which is as far from the physical as you can imagine because it's spiritual, is breath in Latin and its roots. So it's the breath. And it's a good word because when people are talking about spirits, they're invisible. And the breath is mostly invisible. Maybe it wasn't this morning very much. But it's mostly invisible. And yet it's also the vehicle for speech, for words. Words are flowing on breath. So it's not surprising that this is the word that is used in spirituality. But what I want to point out is it gets its meaning, its root is in the breath, which is part of the body. And rather than, I think what that suggests is that we need to have great respect for the breath. Not say, well, that's just part of the body. That's not very interesting. We're interested in ideas or souls or spiritual things, much not just that base body. No, this breath that has moisture in it, that has words, that comes from ourselves and from those we love. It's a very precious thing that deserves great respect, not disregard because it's physical and it's in the body. So spirit is level 2 and breath is level 1, and they connect to each other. Now, many of you know probably the first chapter of the Gospel of St. John, which begins with, in the beginning was the Word, and it flows on, and the Word became flesh. And I think this is a very powerful passage because it's trying to get at something about that doesn't exist physically, but yet can become enfleshed. And what I hope to convince you by the end of this lecture is that, with all due respect to St. John, and he's the idea and the sensibility and the poetry of it all is right on, but it's backwards. It's the flesh-made word. This brain, St. John's brain, our brains, all brains, are the kind of pinnacle of the nervous system that eventually, after 1,000,000 years, and particularly the last couple 100,000, evolved this incredible set of brain capacities that can do abstract reasoning, that can think abstractly. And that is the Word. The Word is in many ways abstract. It's not physical. It's not physically grounded. But it emerged from the flesh. So I'd like to suggest that the flesh-made word is a kind of nice, important way to think about this. Another word that's up there in level 2, that's also in the spiritual realm, is the word karma. I think you're all familiar with it. It's a Hindu word, originally coming from Sanskrit. So karma, I just want to start by pointing out that in level 1, we know that hands act. Hands make things. Hands do things. There are other parts of the body that do that too, but hands are particularly focal point of acting, to make and to do. So the Sanskrit word for karma is action that begins from a cause to make and do things. So, but on level 2, this word has historically come to mean, as it's been practiced in various religious traditions, a cause that makes a life. So it's not so much about picking up objects and moving them around, grasping them, taking them, moving. It's about something much more that may not even involve specific objects. It's about making a life. A life. So it's about a whole course. So, level 2, karma, is the idea that the path of a human being emerges from its initial karma for good and bad deeds. So that's the basic notion behind karma. There's a kind of initial condition that people start with, and it's going to control their path in some ways. Now, I just want to point out to you that in level 1, we have the physics of motion, in which the path of a body emerges from its initial position and velocity. So in the physical world, that manifests itself as bodies that don't just go any old place they might. They have a direction, and they tend to obey that direction. Now, living creatures can really complicate this. If I take a dead bird and I throw it up into the air, it's going to describe almost a perfect parabola, because it's a massive body that's operated on by gravity. But if it's a live bird and I throw it into the air, it'll go where it will. Nonetheless, even as that bird goes where it will, there are physical principles that are governing just what it can do and what it can't do. So there's an important connection between the physics of motion and this very ancient word, karma. They are getting at the same thing we tend to experience in nature and in life. I'll do one more word to illustrate again this connection between level 1, which is the physical origin of words, and level 2, which is which is the use of the word that goes well beyond its physical origin. So this one is dharma. This is also a religious term. And dharma relates to level 1, because back to hands and arms, they hold. Hands hold. I'm holding this. Hands and arms hold. They embrace. So level 2, the meaning of dharma, and this is I'm sure when I mentioned dharma, you weren't thinking of the Sanskrit word to hold. You were thinking of this. It's to hold to the right path of cosmic order. So now hold is, yes, we want to hold, but we're holding to a path. In a way, dharma then bounces back and resonates with karma. So this physical path also is like the path of bodies in motion. Now they're far richer and more complicated, but that's the connection. So I'd now like to talk about how language and thought are grounded in the physical with some other words. And the 4 words I want to focus on are hot and cold, and sharp and dull. These are really important words. They're all over the place in our language, and they are important because they relate to things that are important to the body. Were you cold this morning? Did you go out? And wasn't it important to try to stay warm? The other is sharp and dull. The knife is the most natural place that we use that word, but it's a very important concept, and it comes from this. Let me go here first. Oh, well, that will go here. All right. So, here are some of the ways in which hot and cold are just all over the place in common language. And you know exactly what they're talking about when you see that. We talk about sharp knives, but we also talk about sharp minds, and we talk about dull knife, and then we talk about dullards, and it goes on and on and on. So now what I'd like to talk about is the hidden power of level 1 over the level 2 psyche. So level 2 is, I'm going to let the psyche primarily fill out level 2. That's really not a correct way to think about it, but we'll let it take most of the space for this talk. In level 1, related to hot and cold and sharp and dull, are basically temperature and force. Physical things. It's temperature, force. Now force has two aspects here. It's first of all weight. Something is heavy. The weight is the force, the gravity force pulling down. But it also relates to the intensity of force. If I take a certain amount of force and I concentrate it in a very tiny area, like in the thin blade of a knife, very thin area of the blade of a knife, and I press on it with 5 or 10 pounds of force, I'll slice through things. I will cut things. That's pressure. That is pressure. Intensity, force that's intensified in a small area. Well, it turns out temperature and force are a very big deal for the body and the way we socially interact, because they affect human evaluation and judgment. One of the interesting studies that people have done in recent years is study the psychology of judges, because after all, judges have to sometimes not only pass sentences, they also have to determine innocence and guilt. So out of these studies, one of the things that people wanted to know was, well, how does the physicality of the judge's body affect how he does his job? So in some of these tests, what they do is, and not just judges, sometimes psychology graduate students get to do a lot of this kind of stuff too. But you will do a test where you have a bunch of cases that have been decided, and the cases are written up, and you have to you have to give the sentence, and you know what the sentencing guidelines are, what are the sentences that you can give. So the people who take the test are going to work on that. So when the people are going to take the test, one of the confederates of the people who are doing the test meets the subject at the elevator downstairs. And as they're getting into the elevator, the confederate says, "Could you please hold this drink for me? I'm carrying all these files." And so the person who's going to be taking the test holds the drink. Well, sometimes the drink is a hot drink and sometimes it's a cold drink. So it's a big cup full of ice water, and the elevator's a little slow, and they go, and eventually they get up to where the tests are going to be held, and then they sit down and they start taking the test. Now, for those subjects who were met at the elevator and given the cold drink, compared to those who received no such treatment, they just did the judging, passing sentence activity. Well, what you find is that if you hold a cold drink for a long time, you give harsher sentences. Another place where temperature and force come into play is in interviews, which could be for jobs or for admissions to college or schools or programs of one kind or another, or promotions. Large number of things involve personal interviews for people to make a decision about whether one will get this job or position or promotion. So here again, hot and cold drinks and weight can be brought into the picture. So what you find is that if people are holding warm drinks in the interview, this is the interviewer. He's holding a warm drink. But it might well be that both will be holding a warm drink. In fact, it's very common to give warm drinks, isn't it? You want a cup of coffee or tea? It's a good idea, actually, because everybody is on much better behavior when that's the case. So if people are holding warm drinks, they look more favorably on the person they're interviewing than if they're not holding any drinks at all. Now, another thing is that if the person comes in who the subject is the person who's going to do the interviewing and pass judgment. If the person to be interviewed, the interviewee, comes in with a resume and hands it to the person who will interview them, then the interview person will sort of be flipping through it while asking questions and all of that sort of thing. If it's just a couple of pieces of paper stapled together, that gives one situation. Another person will come in with a bound resume on a lightweight clipboard. And a third person will come in with the resume on a really heavy-duty, elegant clipboard. Really weighs a lot. In numerous tests done over and over again, the person with the heavy clipboard is assumed to be the weighty person, the most competent person. The person with just the little lightweight resume, it comes out lower in the rating, even if the objective things that are in the resume are exactly the same. So weight and temperature are important. Negotiations. People have to negotiate. And if the people who are negotiating are sitting on hard chairs, they take a hard line. I don't know what kind of chairs they put out for Angela Merkel and Vladimir Putin and all the people who are negotiating over this disaster in the Ukraine. But I hope they had some soft sofas, because when people sit in soft sofas, they're more willing to consider the other point of view than sitting on those hard chairs. And again, this has been repeated over and over again. Now, that doesn't mean that nothing else counts. The whole thing will be decided if you've got soft chairs and hard chairs. Yes?
We used to do that when the health department comes in for the survey, and the final day of the survey, we make sure they have soft chairs. It was always a point. Get them soft chairs.
Yeah, well, this has been known for some time, yeah.
I've heard this before, these various things.
Now, then there are other kinds of social interactions. They may not be negotiations, but meetings and so on. If people are wearing sharp or scratchy cloth, or if they're sitting on sharp or scratchy chairs compared to smooth fabrics, the social interaction is difficult. People may not, there's an ingredient that gets injected into it, which was, that didn't go very well. I don't know what went wrong with that meeting. What was wrong with those people? I don't think I liked them that much. That sort of stuff. So, here again, sharp cloth, smooth fabrics, pressure and weight, temperature, all of these play roles. And who's doing all of this? The brain? No, it's the body. Which, of course, is interacting with the brain. We don't mean to say that they don't interact together. So that's, I think, an important lesson. It doesn't mean that it's all about temperature and pressure and weight, as I said. But they're ingredients that are normally ignored, but not anymore. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the brain in the gut, the second brain, which seems kind of remarkable. And also, I just want to point out in this little cartoon, look at that word, gutsy. Where did that come from? What does it mean? You know what it means. It's a level 1 word. It comes right from the gut. So, what's going on with the brain and the gut? Well, it's got about 10% of all the nerves and the neurons of the brain in the head. There's no other part of the body that approaches it or comes anywhere near close to it. So it's got 500 million neurons, and here you see these neurons that are stretched out over the different wall structures of the gut. And it has 100 trillion bacteria that live in that gut. Now those are living beings. We're full of other creatures that are alive inside us. We're full of bacteria. Occasionally we have viruses too, but and these bacteria are beneficial. We could not exist without them. They digest our food for us. So there's 100 trillion bacteria. We have about 3 pounds of bacteria in our bodies. And we have 40 species of bacteria who collectively have 100 times the genes in the human genome. So now we find that we're not only full of nerves in the gut, the gut is full of agents, full of other living beings. So gut bacteria can have a big impact on mood and mind because neurochemicals affect the brain and nervous system. In fact, the body uses neurochemicals to send messages and receive messages. It's like the chemical communication network of the body. It not only has the electrical network, like the wires in the nerve system, those are the electrical, that's the electrical network, but it's got a chemical network. It's sending messages and receiving messages via these chemical pathways, mainly through the blood vessels. You've probably heard of some of these neurochemicals. Serotonin is a really important neurochemical. 90% of the body's serotonin is manufactured in the gut. And then there's GABA and BDNF. We're not going to go into the names of those. They're fairly complicated names. And those are just the leading ones. So these neurochemicals are made and interacted with by the bacteria in the gut. So a lot of people were interested to know, well, how does the brain in the gut, affect the brain in the head and the nervous system and the emotional system? So, as you know, because we're mammals, we have enormous chemistry and biology that is the same in all mammals. And a lot of our basic studies of human biology, because we can't do these kinds of experiments with human beings, are done with mice. So there are lots of different strains of mice, and one of the strains that has been bred is a timid, shy mouse. That means if you put it in a maze, it doesn't want to go out and explore very much in the maze, and it's shy about meeting other mice. On the other hand, there's another strain called NIH Swiss. This is called BALBC, and this is the NIH Swiss. This mouse is bold and adventurous. You put it into a maze and it starts running around. It wants to see where everything is, what's going on. So that's the nature of these mice. Now, I should mention that when mammals are born, the gut is actually sterile. And the first dose of bacteria actually comes in the dose that the animal, in the case of human beings, the human being gets in passing through the birth canal. The birth canal is full of bacteria. And so that rubs off onto the newborn, and that's that first exposure of bacteria. And it's perfectly right that nature has evolved this way of doing it, because who knows through all the evolutionary pathways that exist and the different environments that creatures can exist in, maybe you really want to know what's the bacteria right here where this newborn is going to have to live, and it gets infected with it right off the bat from the mother's birth canal. So here are these mice. Now what people wanted to know is, well, what if we took them and didn't let them have their natural bacterial endowment? What if we kept them sterile and then injected them with the opposite mouse's gut material? So you're going to take the ingredients of one mouse's gut and transplant them in the other, and vice versa. You're going to switch guts, so to speak. So you colonize these in the opposite way, and what you find is they switch. So the one that was formerly timid and shy now becomes bold and adventurous, and the one that was adventurous now becomes timid and shy. Now these experiments, they're not one-off experiments. They've been replicated. But how to interpret these experiments, I want to say at this point, how to interpret these experiments about the gut and the brain, this is all very new stuff, and I think it needs to have a little bit of caution. So I'm cautioning you about this right now. I think these are interesting results, and they are true results. But how to understand them is not clear yet. So another thing that people have done is take this BALBC strain of mice, which is the timid, shy mouse, and they feed it a probiotic. Now, probiotics are new, they're very fashionable at the moment. And again, I want to caution, it's a really kind of fashionable wave that one needs to be cautious about. But so these were fed a lactobacillus. This lactobacillus is one of the the bacteria that's in yogurt and other kinds of milk products. So when you feed the probiotic to this timid, shy mouse, it does become more adventurous. Now, here's one of the things that you do with mice that you can't do with human beings. They have a test which is called the force swim test. So when they're trying to look at mice and see how driven they are for survival and for achieving safety, they put them in a swimming tank. So then the mouse has to swim and swim and swim and swim and swim and swim and swim until he gives up. And he gives up, and then he just back floats. And so that's the forced swim test. So when they did this forced swim test with this timid, shy mouse that was fed probiotics, it had less corticosterone in its feces, which is often used to figure out how stressed out animals are. People who study gorillas and apes will look at their droppings and analyze them for the corticoids in them, which tell them how stressed out these animals are. So there's less stressed, and there was increased GABA. That's one of those neurochemicals we mentioned earlier, that one of the things it does is suppress anxiety. Okay, so again, before you run out and want to buy all kinds of probiotics and invest in stock in probiotics, this is very new stuff, and it needs to settle down and be more carefully studied before we come to any big conclusions. Another one is, suppose the gut has parasites. Now, this is not unusual. Human beings do suffer from parasites in the gut. And these mice with guts in their parasites, parasites in their gut, they had decreased BDNF and they had anxious behavior. But that seems to be kind of typical of living creatures. If something's not right, if you know something's not right, you're going to be slightly on guard. You could say it's anxious. Well, it doesn't have to be necessarily wringing your hands in anxiety, but it's like a little switch goes on. It says something's not working right. Something's not quite right. So when there's a parasite in the gut, that's what happens to the animal, and that's a perfectly good and beneficent natural phenomenon to have happen. So now if you treat this with another one of these beneficial bacteria, that has the effect of combating the parasite to some extent. Now, the only thing that's going to completely combat that parasite is something that will remove it. And just drinking yogurt is not necessarily going to remove parasites. But it can give more normal behavior and remove some of the anxious behavior. Maybe that's good, but maybe that's not so good. Maybe if something's not right, you should know about it. So these are the probiotics that are very popular right now, the Lactobacillus rhamnosus, Helveticus, longum, and these are in yogurt, sauerkraut, and other natural products that you can learn more about. And now what I'd like to talk about is the gut and the brain in response to ambiguously angry or fearful faces. Could it make any difference what's going on in your gut, how you would respond? And what I'm showing you is a pair of faces that are the kinds that psychologists use in these tests, where they carefully try to orchestrate the faces so that they're ambiguous. I mean, you don't really know if this person is really angry or fearful. You can say he's not happy, but is he? There are other faces that you will look at and you'll say, that person is scared, or that person is really angry. But this is ambiguous, and that's the design of the experiment. So what happens if you give people, if you let people look at these kinds of pictures who have no probiotics for 4 weeks? Well, they don't have any probiotics, so I guess it doesn't make any difference. But if you have a control group that looks at these pictures, there will be a certain level of disturbed response. A certain statistical proportion of a large group that's participating will have a disturbed response, although not all will, but there will be a significant disturbed response. If you take the same pictures and use them with people who have been on probiotics, taking them 3 times a day for 4 weeks, and then taking this test, there is a significant statistical less disturbed response. So again, these are, again, fairly new kinds of tests. I'm sure the psychologists will come up with even more tests to do and experiments to run. But I think they're interesting, and they do point out, once again, something you already knew. What's going on in your gut is kind of important to how you feel and how you be, and it's not surprising. But it's interesting to see what the details look like, how it works. That's very interesting. And I think what I want to end with is again saying we have a mind and a brain in the head. We have a gut and a second brain in the gut. And obviously, from what I've been telling you now, the gut, second brain, has a role to play in influencing and interacting with. It's a player in the mind and the brain, in the head. But the other thing I want to point out to you is it's a two-way street. And the mind and brain in the head can lead to a healthy gut, or it can, in its own way, cause trouble for the gut, just as the gut can cause trouble for the mind. Or the two can be in great harmony. That's what we'd all like to have, is the good harmony between the gut and the mind and the brain. In fact, what we'd like is good harmony all over the place, all over ourselves, the human species, and all of the places that are not in harmony right now. And I think that's going to be the end of this lecture. We can now have some questions and comments. Yes?
Does that kind of explain like IBS?
Oh, say it again, and I'm going to ask you all to again speak up, speak loudly when you ask a question.
Yeah. Does that kind of explain IBS, that the mind and the brain impacts the gut just like the gut impacts the mind and the brain? That the mind and the brain may actually be contributing to our experiences of irritable bowel syndrome, those kinds of ailments?
Probably. It's a complicated business because if you've got parasites, that, is a kind of first order explanatory feature. But can you say, well, a person wasn't living healthily, he was wasting his life and he got parasites? That's a hard stretch, I think. But I think when it comes to these more kind of psychological states of being where people are unpeaceful and the gut's unpeaceful and people are unpeaceful, but why is the person unpeaceful? That's a kind of mysterious business. And it takes us back to the karma dharma. But I think one would like to have as much as possible a kind of natural balance between these things. I mean, if you say, yes, and you start anxiously buying all kinds of probiotics and are studying and looking at web pages on probiotics and are reading book after book on probiotics and the gut and its health and how it can make you healthy, while you don't go out and run or walk or look at the sky or cook or do good, normal human things, you can see that kind of behavior is messing up your gut.
The running and stuff, the lack of running is messing up your gut, not necessarily the probiotics. Well, the probiotics are preventing you from running and doing that stuff. How is that associated?
This is the probiotics can incrementally change, or the absence of them can incrementally decrease these neurochemical levels that we were talking about. But they're not the whole story. So they're incremental changes.
So I can throw my box away and quit paying that ridiculous price. I'm just doing it.
Oh, is this probiotics?
Yeah.
Why don't you just get into eating yogurt and sauerkraut and pickles?
I do that too, and I run, well, I don't run and hike and do all that kind of stuff.
Uh-huh.
Physically, yeah.
Yeah. I think it ought to be possible for most people to naturally, but now, for many years I never ate yogurt. It's only recently that I've been eating a lot more yogurt. I've discovered as I've gotten older, I can't just rely on eat anything you want. Well, not anything you want. Anything that tastes good, that is healthy, that you enjoy, and so on. Yes, but yes, speak up.
This just seems so the parallel human evolution, physical and mental development. You don't have starving people coming up with great ideas. The great ideas come from a comfortable, civilized community, people with the time and resources to fill their gut comfortably and then sit back, relax, and come up with a great idea. The starting.
There is a minimal level that a human being has to have in terms of nutrition to not be totally, to expand into other activities that human beings do other than simply stay alive. You've got to get above that minimal level. Now, we're way above it. We have, the developed world now is facing an obesity problem. So it's kind of gone the other direction. And the link between having a filled gut and creative thinking, I think, as I said, there's a minimal level, but I think too much can be made of it. I mean, Isaac Newton was living at a time in England of the British Civil Wars. This was a very nasty time. And I'm not sure how well people were fed in 17th century England. But I don't think it was quite at the level that you might be thinking of. But yet he was able to think quite creatively. But you're right, there's a minimal level that's needed.
I think that minimal level is the level that I would project to be in our cousins, the other primates, whereas we became less resourced well enough to be able to have our creative heart, time to set aside and develop our thought processes. I don't think you've got to be above the minimum level, absolutely, to be able to be the humans that we are now. I think on the most primitive level, that occurred as we evolved and maybe part and parcel of how we evolved. We just may have evolved in a place, a location, and a time when there was sufficient resources for us to get our gut full.
If we're still here, it's because we got through that bottleneck. Yes?
Yes. First of all, this has been very interesting. I'm very glad I came today. It makes logical sense that the gut controls the mind to an extent and that the mind can control the gut to an extent. And what I think would be interesting is if you could actually, through meditation and through certain mental processes, actually physically change the processes that are happening in your gut. It'd be a neat experiment, I think.
To what end?
Well, to actually change the microbial activity in your gut through mental
Oh,
function.
just to show that it could be, just to show that it can be done.
Yeah, I wonder if you could, I mean, there is that.
I wouldn't be surprised if there are experiments going on right now, exactly like that. Any other questions or comments? Shall we now just have some snacks? And if you want to continue questioning and commenting, we can do it while we snack. To the gut.